Hello, everybody. Here with Erin. She's gonna be doing most of the talking, but gonna be talking about product-led communities and building communities around products and all that fun stuff, which Erin has a great amount of experience in. But I guess Erin, if you want to kick us off with some background on yourself and whatnot, we can delve into the good stuff.
Yeah, so first and foremost, it's kind of always awesome to be here and with all the community chat people. I stumbled into community management development like I believe many of us kind of do. We all just kind of fall into it. I came from a background, I both have an undergraduate and soon to be a master's in journalism. So I studied media and originally wanted to be a politician. So there's some weird tangents you can go down there. Clearly, obviously, it didn't work out. Realized it's not really my jam. But I've kind of fell into loving like both. I've worked at agencies and really kind of fell into that startup scene of like loved working, like building and trying new things, which I think especially early stage startups are found of. So very much in a happy spot. I've done community building from anything from local newsrooms, audience engagement strategies at, large recognized newspapers and kind of diving into like different tactics for anything from small communities to giant, enormous, more of product-led communities. So it's kind of where I found most of my strength is running product-led communities, either a lot of developer communities or open source communities, and kind of what can we learn from each other online is a big, curious fascination of mine.
Awesome. Yeah, appreciate it. I know we've talked in a bit about all the master stuff you're doing, and it's super interesting. But I guess to start us off, in your own words, how would you define product-led community? Because I think it's product-led is a term that I think most people know. Community is a term most people know, but I think product-led community is actually, at least in my experience, relatively new as a term. At least people talk about it commonly.
Yeah, I think like we're now starting to kind of it's the cool thing to do right now, which I would argue is a dangerous place to be in. I think it's the cool thing to do, but it's also a very dangerous area. So one, we know what product led means. So kind of really thinking about what is product, but I would also almost like to zoom out a little bit because what we've considered as a quote unquote product has drastically changed within the last 10 years. So now we're considering news media as product. We're considering any piece of information as product, any way that we're consuming information, whether it's a podcast, a Twitter feed, all of that kind of stuff. Those are all different forms of product, so to speak. So a product-led community is a community that's centered around a specific purpose, which its main purpose is to either offer support, offer guidance, offer, another network of people who love this product all around a specific brand, so to speak. So rather than it being like a bunch of people who love knitting, it's a bunch of people who love knitting by a yarn company. So it is being driven and moved forward by a specific brand entity. So blame it on capitalism, I guess. It's part of that downfall.
I mean, I guess it could be. It's still better than some of the old ways of like air quote building community that I think product companies did 10 years ago, where they're like, it's a community. And you're like, no, it's a Twitter account. And it's like, things like that. But I mean, from my perspective, I think it's like those companies are basically going two ways with their community, right? There's like the product-led community approach, which is like you have to kind of like get in through the outer walls of a company before you even get to the community. Like you're already a customer, you like the product, or you want to learn more about the product. Then there's more of like the community of interest angle, which is like, what we're doing with the community club, right? It's not the ComStore community. It's not about ComStore. Like you basically never talk about ComStore there, but it's a community for the people that would be target customers of ComStore, community builders. And it's like, those are the two different kind of angles that companies seem to be going with community. And there's definitely pros and cons to both and whatnot. It's what's the word I'm looking for?
Yeah, it's a weird, and some of them it's like there's an interesting dichotomy that happens. Like if you build a product, like there's do I build the product and then I launch a community, or do I build a community and then launch a product? Which is an interesting dichotomy that we have, because you'll see a lot of people on Twitter will argue like build a community first and then build a product, and then or build a product first and then build your community. And I don't think there's a right answer, which is maybe like my hot take. Like I do not think there's a right answer. And I think if that's the question you're asking, you maybe need to go back to your roadmap a little bit.
I think that applies to like I always say with all community advice, right? It's like, this is how you do community. except for the 50% of the time that doesn't apply. And it's like, because community is so broad, and what a product led community for one company looks like a physical product versus a software product versus a service product, right? Like those are going to be three very different communities that are all going to be tossed into the, not just the community bucket, but the product led community bucket. I think a lot of the product led communities of the past, 10 years, they happened unintentionally, right? It's like they were like a product of product led growth in a way, where it's like I look at companies like Figma or Notion who now are investing in community intentionally, but those communities sprung up without them having someone on their team doing it and thinking about it and setting out to build a community. And that's where, once again, the idea of like, should you start with community or not? The best way to build a product led community is probably to build a good product.
Yeah. It's like build a good product and be open about the process. Like, I think that's another one. A community I love to study is the Lego community. So I actually
example.
It's like the best, like, it's like, and no one talks about, like, there are Lego fan clubs all over the world. I was very fortunate. I got to contract for a while for a STEM related Lego company. It was really awesome. And they actually but there's like Lego master builders. There's adult fans of Lego. There are homeschool groups of Legos. There is the corporate entity that is the Lego sponsored Lego community. There are the thousands of companies that use Lego and have licenses to use Lego within their product. So it's like Lego is a great example because you have a blend of both fan built community and you have like their internal company community that they've also kind of kick off.
It's really interesting. They've actually, I have a lot to say on on Lego. I am one of those like the AFOLs as they call them, like the adult fans of Lego. Like when I was in high school, I went to like Lego conferences and stuff. Really, real super Lego nerd there.
I mean, I bought my husband a Lego Lego Star Wars advent calendar.
I mean, I bought myself one, so. But I think it's interesting that you have you talk about community starting versus the company starting the community. Recently, Lego, there was a company called Bricklink, which was like a Lego community / marketplace for buying and selling Lego. It's kind of like eBay for Lego, and it's been around for 15, 20 years almost. And it was just, I can't remember if it was beginning of this year or end of last year because time has had no meaning for the last 12 months. But they recently bought them. And it was really interesting as well, seeing how the community reacted to that, right? Like they actually felt like it was Lego overstepping their bounds and actually going into like, hey, this is like our space that's not owned by Lego. So there's always that interesting challenge, I think, with community as well, where or like look at Notion, right? Notion has, there are fan Facebook groups and Slack groups and Telegram chats that Notion doesn't own, and the type of conversation that happens there versus on the, the spaces owned by Notion are very different. So do you have any thoughts on how companies can balance that? Because I think also a lot of companies, I talk to, CMOs all the time about community. They're like, but we're going to let company members like talk to each other and say bad things about us. Like, we don't want to allow that, right? I think that's one of the classic humps that you have to overcome as a, when you're trying to pitch community to stakeholders.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important question. So first off and foremost, like if you get in a community, that means you have to talk to people, which means you have to be a person, which I think we forget. And like people means full people. Like this means all of your people. This means on your good days and your bad days, on days you don't want to people. Sorry, you've got a community. You kind of need to people a little bit. And maybe that's not you peopling, but someone for your brand needs to be a people. And I think like even in bad times, community can act as that rallying force. So I think that's like my first foremost caveat, which is like the general community building stance. But next up, like if you were looking, there's two ways of kind of approaching that brand community. So you can either do very much what Lego did and bought, bought a community essentially, or you can build on your own from scratch. There's kind of pros and cons with each. But I think the way that we need to do it is if we are looking at buying a community, you need to get buy-in from your community members because obviously they're going to feel betrayed. They're going to feel, kind of crushed, a little mournful, a little sad, a little, angry. Like, I mean, which in all defense, they should. Like, they probably
you're afraid of like the corporate overlord coming in and being like, this is mine now.
Exactly. And corporate overlords, sometimes I'm going to just, say it like it is, haven't done the best job of actually being good community people. Like that means having
seems like it's changing a little bit now, hopefully, maybe.
I think like it's definitely changing, but I think with all my concern with all this community hype is that as we get more community going, it's like I really want to give the caveat of like, do you need a product-led community? And like, do you need a community? Like, and really be honest with yourself on that, because that's where I see the misalignment happening when
What do you,
it's, okay.
sorry. Yeah, I was like, what do you think about this idea of like, like companies needing community? And I totally agree, right? It's like,
Yeah.
how many communities about sales do you need? Like, there are how many thousands of tools and companies out there building tools for salespeople? They don't all need a community
Mm-mm.
for salespeople. But what do you think about this idea of like the difference between like, where like the blurring lines between audience and community start to come into play where, would you consider it a product led community for a company that maybe doesn't have a traditional community? They don't have a forum or a Slack or any of those, traditional things. They, it's just, I think a lot of like this happens a lot with like physical products, right? Versus like software products. Like, they live on Instagram, right? They don't have a space that we in the community world would be like, oh yeah, that's a community. But do you think a lot of the principles of building product led communities still apply to kind of like product led audiences in a way?
Yeah. Well, and very much so. So I've actually been reading this book recently called Super Fandom, which is written by Zoe Freyd Blinar, which is always a great book to read. And I'm very fortunate to have studied under Zoe. So I kind of get a win-win there. But in the book, it kind of talks about this idea that the internet accelerated our access to an audience. Like we previously, like we would gather outside of town halls and be really hyped about things. But now we're like, okay, we have direct access. Like in some ways, Instagram killed paparazzis because we have direct accesses into their homes and their Instagram lives, and we know who's dating who and what's the latest trends. And that's kind of this precursor into a product-led community. So as much as we have that, we now have direct audience to our fans, and we now have direct audiences to people who just want to hype us up. So, we're building community whether or not we really realize it, just by engaging and being active. So, those really big Instagram accounts of 5-6 years ago when it would get the thousands of comments and people would release something on their Instagram and you'd be like, oh my goodness. Or one like example that comes very straight to mind is, remember when Beyonce just like randomly dropped an album on everybody and everybody was like, the Beehive, the Beehive. Yes, because that was an example of how we were treating community without really calling it a community at that point. But it's still a very much brand-led community.
No, I think that's a great way of putting it. So it's one of those, I think, never-ending debates in the world of community, the audience versus community thing. And I've always said that, even the things that are hardcore audience that don't have community, they're still part of this like broader community picture. I think that's where it's also, it can be hard for, I think, brands to wrap their head around community because every other function at a company, sales, marketing, success, support, whatever it is, you can define their goal in a single sentence. Like sales is like drive more sales, get more customers. Support is like make customers happy, like all these different things, right? Whereas like it's like define community's goal in one sentence, and you could probably find a way to do it, but it's pretty hard to just be like, this is the singular reason this community exists, which always makes it harder to get that buy-in. So I guess sort of an open-ended question, but thoughts on people who are maybe at companies where they're kind of like, it's always this where it's like you got a 100-person company who hires a community manager, and it's like, all right, cool, we got to build a community, but we're also not bought into it. So any thoughts on like proving the value, I guess, of a product-led community for people who are trying to do that for their their managers and bosses and executive teams?
Yeah, and I think this goes back to kind of starting that community off first off. So it's very much like, what do you want in your community? That's starting out. Like, are you creating a community because some dude on Twitter said you needed a community? Then
because every VC told you had to.
Yeah, like let's go back to square one. You probably don't need a community if that's your only incentives. If like my role right now is like I'm a product marketing manager. Like I'm not a community manager. Community falls under my purview, and they're very heavily invested in it. But I have to also control 16 other aspects of a brand, which is totally fine and fun. But I think like a lot of my data is like, what are our goals of communities? So like a lot of my personal goals with communities is building brand advocates. So I want to take those super fans who stalk us at tech conferences and turn them into super big brand advocates. And I go, okay, great. I talked to 20 people today. When I talk to them, they released this new information. I look at a lot of like organic social posts. So what are people in our community kind of tweeting out? How am I actively kind of engaging with people and like getting them going is one thing. So am I creating a brand advocate? And you need to define for you what a brand advocate is. Is it someone who I can send something has 100% open rates on my emails? Is it someone who tweets about me? Is it someone who I can send them a link to a product and they will buy it within the first 30 minutes? What is that person? I think, setting those goals right. Is it a customer support community? Do I want to be able to answer questions? So if someone comes to me and they're like, I don't know how to use your software. And then it's like, okay, now my community's job is to do this. So did I relieve pressure on customer, requests for help? So if you have a CX team, it's like, did my number of requests for help go down because I've directed people to a community of other people who can help out instead? Is it creating content, which we've seen a lot of like volunteer organizations, or even in the newsroom, kind of, there's communities of fact checkers that happen. And I think that's a really great example of like that our goal is to create content for people. So we've created X number of articles, we've verified X number of facts. Like these are all stats that you can prove your community has value to someone who may be like, I don't actually know about what community is, or I don't care, or I'm overwhelmed, that are all providing value. And one thing is like, you didn't have to invest in X because your community did Y. And I think if you can put it in that formula, that's an easy way of thinking about like, okay, my community and my product-led community did good.
Yeah, no, I think it's the what I've been calling like it's like telling the story of community, right? I think a lot of community managers fall into what I call like the cardinal sin of like proving value, which is like, we have 10,000 members. That's up from 5,000 last quarter. And it's like, all right, cool. Your boss is going to say, and I care that we have more members because like, what does that mean? So one of the things I've tried to, I guess pitch to people is this idea of like comparing like what a community member looks like versus a non-community member, or like what someone looked like as a customer before they joined your community and what they look like after they engage with it. If you can show that like, their NPS went up, or their their likelihood of buying went up, or their number of support tickets went down, like you just said, that's how you prove it. It's like this comparison of like before community, during community, after community, and being able to tell that story can really help drive that home. I think it's a lot of like B2B companies seem to have bought into it even without the metrics. I think where a lot of companies were like, I mean, I hear from it all the time, companies that are like more in the product space, like the physical product space, where they're like, they seem to not get it as easily as software companies do. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on like the differences there between, a product-led community for, I can't even think of a physical product off the top of my head right now versus, a software product-led community, like where the nuanced differences are there, if any.
Yeah, I think the nuanced differences is like, one, you still have the same goals. Like even if it's a hardware product or a software product, there's the running joke of a hardware product is exactly like a software product. It's just harder. There's like the joke of that, but there is some truth behind that. Like production timelines are really real. So I was actually looking at a recent announcement of like products that failed to launch or failed to go bad, and was like, how could community have potentially saved these products? And so looking at that, there's an interesting perspective if we look at that and see, okay, this product failed to launch, and that could have been a hardware product, but how did they approach it and how they handled the situation? So were they honest? Did they tell people if it was they spent money for a product, what they were going to do about it? If someone bought into it, like just providing that kind of clear expectations of it is really interesting. One brand I actually love to refer to and have been fortunate to kind of work at when I was at agency is Patagonia. So each Patagonia local store has events that usually support their direct local community. So I was based in Reno, Nevada at an agency. We worked directly with the Reno, Nevada Patagonia office. And so we did a lot of like partnerships and with other groups in the area. So we would do in-person meetups, plan events, and kind of help them out with, I was on the graphics side, so making sure that everybody had the graphics in place. But you would watch this sort of community come together. And it would be, yes, we would be talking about the Patagonia like sweatshirts and the gear and the, one, we made t-shirts that $10 or whatever went to the nonprofit. But on that same point, it's like we were also educating about a mission. So if you're doing a physical product, I think Lego's another great example. Like we see Lego communities about, hey, you've got this Lego set. There's a brick builder where I think it's like those brick builder sites where it's like you need 4 brown blocks and 3 green blocks and blah, blah, blah. And that's a way of like doing fan created builds is another way of kind of getting people to engage even further with showing new ways to use a product. So it's like you're getting people to engage even further with something that they already know. I feel like I touched on a few crazy different.
Yeah, there's like a couple different rabbit holes we could go down there. I think when you first started talking, what I was asking about like companies that you think do product led really well, and you brought up Patagonia. I'm curious if any other examples come to mind. Maybe another one in the physical space, and then one in the software space if you have one, and then why you think they do well. Because I think that's also one of the things with community, right? Is because it's so hard to define and so hard to be like, this is the singular end goal. Like sales, you can go and read a book and it's like, okay, I know how to do sales now. community, there's so much content out there, and it's kind of ironic we're like making content right now that I'm saying this, but there's so many, but like, I don't think the best way to actually learn about community is to like read content. It's actually to look at how others are doing it. And it's like a little bit of like, like the great artists, what's it? Good artists copy, great artists steal, whatever that saying is. Like, there's a little bit of like, look at what your favorite communities are doing and like, piece them together to build your own.
I've been weirdly looking into celebrities as community inspiration lately. So Beyonce, I recently mentioned, but even like how different like celebrity or like fan group organizations drive community building. Because I think we can learn a lot from how, like, think about it, like this whole concept, like there's all that, like I live in New York, so like there's all the like fashion accounts that are like, so and so wore this on this avenue in New York, and it's like admittedly like we all are like, ooh, that's kind of cringy, but like then we all stupid follow the account just because we want to see what happens. So I think we can learn a lot from actually how people like interact with celebrities. Lizzo is a great example. So like, how does Lizzo take her brand from Twitter to TikTok, and does like an amazing way of engaging and being super engaging with her fans there. So for a while she was doing TikToks of like people would like sing her songs and she would reply to them, which is like a really fun little way of doing that. So I think like that's where my
making it interactive, right? Versus like the old way of doing like things like that for celebrities was like, here's what I ate for lunch today. It's like, oh wow, like that's what Lizzo ate for lunch. That's so cool. But people got really tired of that really quickly, right? So now it's like the community, they're not the communities, the influencers and celebrities who are doing it well have found ways to actually like turn that audience into more interactive things. And it is interesting. I've seen a lot of platforms that are trying to build like what I would call like Instagram with community features built in, because obviously Instagram doesn't have a lot of, I mean, they have some things, you can do polls and stories and things, but I mean, I've seen an explosion of people building in that space. And I think it's an interesting sign of like where that celebrity influencer community is trending towards.
Yeah. And I think it also allows for more people to be jumping up on that stage as well. So like you kind of alluded it to earlier, but like the numbers game is crap. Like I don't really care. Like if you have 10,000 members in your community, that's great. But like, are you serving those 10,000 members? And if you're not, then you probably shouldn't have a 10,000 member community.
I can't tell you how many I see where it's like, we have 10,000 members and 500 were active in the last 6 months.
Yeah,
it's like, oh crap. Okay.
Or I'm a chronic early adopter. Like I have like 50 something Slack channels I'm in. And like, I've hit the point now where I'm like, okay, I'm not checking Slack as much. And I'm checking like the 5 Slack channels that I'm in. I'm checking the few Reddits that I'm in. I'm checking, the own communities that I manage. I'm checking my own. So my independent research is on the creator economy and like the viability of like community building as it relates to the creator economy, which is a very, niche subject. So I'm like checking those communities. And so, but I just don't have time. Like I used to be very active in the triathlon.
Community fatigue.
Yeah. Like I'm used to be super active in the triathlon subreddit, but you guys haven't done anything to serve me in this pandemic. So I'm just crying that my triathlons are canceled. So it's like, learn from the communities that you actually want to be a part of, and think about like the brands that you follow that, aren't straightforward. Like I'm a community of Lizzo fans. It's like, no, I just followed Lizzo on TikTok because she was super awesome. And like the same way, like I think Beyonce does a great example. You asked of other communities. I'm fascinated by the Rome cult. Like the whole like Rome cult on Twitter. I love like, because it's so like, and I've even tried to use Rome and I personally couldn't get into it.
Oh, like same. I follow it all because the community is fascinating, but like, I don't get the product at all.
And everybody who like uses it and gets it, I'm like, I want this like energy that you have, but I don't understand. Like I'm a Notion fan. So like, I'm like a diehard Notion person. So like I'm in a Discord for Notion, which is all like fan created Notion people. Another really interesting community is, okay, I will like out myself here as like being one of those people who downloaded Animal Crossing and then didn't get off it for like the first 24 hours that was off, is the Nookazon community, which is very fascinating to me, of like just people trading and buying different Nook materials from the Nook store. And I think like the Among Us communities that have popped up have like totally captivated me. So it's like, how are these ways of like taking something that we were already doing, that we were going to do anyway, and making it an entirely new experience? So that's where my brain's running. Sort
of an idea there, and I haven't quite figured out how to word this yet. So I'm kind of thinking it up on the spot as I go here, which is pretty much my MO. But this idea of like, it's funny, we call it like a product led community, right? You mentioned there, like a lot of the communities you mentioned, I would actually say are like community led, where it's like no one intended for the community to exist, like
Mhm.
Rome, Animal Crossing, Notion, right? They built good things. And I think there's something there on this idea of like, building a community is actually not about leading the community. Like it's not really a product led community. It's about building the framework and the boundaries in which a community can exist and letting the community be the community, right? Like the Among Us stuff, the Animal Crossing stuff, like they didn't set out to be like, this is the Animal Crossing community and like this is how you act in it and things
Mhm.
like that, right? And I think Lego is a great example again of they saw what other people were doing and then they built structure around it to enable that to go and get scaled to a whole nother degree. So I wonder if there's almost this idea of like it shouldn't be product led community, it should be like community led product.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I think like we're figuring out, I think we're still in the wild, wild west. I joke, but this has been my 2020 joke of like, we're in the wild, wild west of communities and like,
We really are though.
like it's so wild. Like everybody I talk to is like, oh, you work in community? Like, and I'm like, yes, I used to do.
But like 6 months ago, they were like, what
What
does
do you
working
do?
in community mean, right? They're
I
like,
mean,
what?
my parents still think that like, and I send them to some of the stuff that I do in community and I'm like, Mom, do you get it? And they're like, please don't talk to strangers on the internet. I'm like,
my dad's way, he's like, okay, so you're doing like Facebook 2.0. I'm like, no, but okay, because they think online, they think community. It's like, oh, Facebook.
Oh, see, I've got so my parents are like very like, my mom is an accountant, my dad's an engineer and teaches math. So like there's like very like square grid people. And then I was like, I'm gonna go study journalism and art. So one time my dad was like, you spam the internet for a living. And I'm like, please don't ever say that. Like, that is very bad words. Like, he was like, no, you just like send messages to people all day. Like, that's what you do, right? And I'm like, yes, but
Yeah.
no.
Well, I get the classic, like, you sit in front of a computer and money shows up in your bank account. What are you doing? I'm like, I mean, when you put it that way, it sounds weird, but I guess that's kind of accurate.
Right. But I think, like, to that, not to play devil's advocate, because I hate those people that are like, devil's advocate, but like to kind of push back on that idea, I think we're also seeing people like products that need to have more community and you need to like, they need to be driven by the product. And I think the newsroom is the perfect example of that, or even podcasts or any place that has quantified information. So if you are someone with an information of record, like a newsroom where you are acting as a source of truth, like a database or a newsroom or like the CDC, for example, you should probably build some more community strategy into your product because your product at the end of the day is information. So you want to like, if you like, we've all read the terrible Facebook comments that come from reading a local newspaper. You like cringe and hide and you go, why isn't someone monitoring
Like,
this?
those
What are
can't be
you
real
doing?
people, right? Like, that's not a real person. Like, that person doesn't actually exist.
Yeah, like I'm like, what are you like? Ugh, and you just are like, you see the news article posted and it has 47 comments, and you're just like crying because you're like, and you go like, my gut goes, wow, like someone needs to, and like the newsrooms do have it. It's usually an audience engagement editor that falls under this umbrella called audience engagement, which is like what news industry calls community building. But on that same perspective, it's like maybe we should start building a little more forward frontal like approaches to community building. And like maybe if we're doing information, like you should be a community of record of like, here's how you act, here's what you do. I know The Verge actually has a comment section and they have some of the best terms of conditions ever, if you need an interesting rabbit hole to run down. But they've kind of started to build it, or Talking Points Memo, which is another news outlet, has a forum that they manage. But it's in these forums that are very much volunteer ran that have some kind of like interesting things that like I'm very interested to see of like what this development will be. It is my hope that we see like bridges form between some of the people in tech and media, which is kind of my personal
versus like the opposite, which is like one side says the other is evil and the other says the other side is always wrong.
Yeah. I'm like, as someone who's
kind of build community 101, right?
Yeah, it's like as someone who's kind of dabbled in both worlds, I'm like, well, all right.
Well, I think if you think about it in a weird way, it's like the internet of the past decade or a little longer than that. It's a lot easier to build community via division than it is to build community by bringing people together, right? It's much quicker to be like A and B should be like are at odds. People very quickly be like, okay, I am A or I am B, and like very quickly like you'll have a community of B and a community of A, right? But it's like you're saying, the future has to be more about like how do you actually like build real value versus just And that's where you see like the classic, like the Facebooks and the Twitters where it's like they make more ad money when people post fake news and get mad and get divisive versus like actually bringing people together. So there's a lot of, I think, also room for like a lot of the companies that are, maybe actually like the product is the community could learn a lot from product led communities. Because I think product led communities have the benefit of the community itself doesn't have to make money, right? Because there's a product backing the community, which can justify the community's existence. And there's a lot of struggle where when the community has to make money, it's like either you're going to charge someone, and you're seeing all the news outlets and journalism going that round. It's like, how dare Business Insider like put a paywall up for this article? It's like, okay, but like you also complained when they were free that they had ads. So like,
or like my favorite one, I literally, okay, this was my, like, I should have developed a better hobby during the election week, is like when people would trash journalism online, I'd be like, but how many times did you refresh the page and you didn't pay for a journalist? Because like, pay for them now. Like, you don't get to do that. So sorry if I trolled you on the internet.
Like, no, and I think it is interesting. There's a lot of like community led models that I think are starting. They're in the very beginning phases here, and it's sometimes hard to talk about because I think it's community, what it is for a news organization versus a tech company versus a product. Like, it's 10 different. I would say yes, 10 different people to define community. You'll get 10 different answers, which always makes it very hard to like explain what the hell we're trying to do with our lives, right? And I just totally lost the question I was going with there, but
yeah,
that one.
It opens up some like interesting, like I'm like my interest, like if I had to like think of things that Erin is extremely passionate about, they all have overlap in like weird ways. So it's like I love the tech media debate and like this like space that they both exist in, that they're both constantly mad at each other. And like personally in my brain, I'm like, why don't we just like, I don't want to be like, just get over it and get along, because I feel like that's never the answer to solving feuds.
And it never works.
And it never works.
It makes both sides hate you instead of
and I'm like, okay,
hate each other.
I don't really know the answer here. But like that section, I'm extremely fascinated. Then it's like the community building section, which I'm like super fascinated about. Then it's like, okay, so what the hell is next? Like internet fandom, like product, Erin land things exist here. Like those are my three pillars of like where I kind of refine to for information, which leads me to like weird corners on the internet, which is okay, I think. But wow,
that's most of the internet, to be fair. But
I mean, yeah, right, most of the internet. And I think the thing that like there's two areas that I don't think we talk about enough in product led communities, and it's like, one, if you built a community and it's a brand led community, what happens if you don't have the resources to manage it? Because let's talk about that. And
the community gets too big for the company.
Yeah, like what is your plan of attack, and what happens if your company doesn't exist anymore?
Like the first one, I think Rome is almost a potentially good example. Like Rome's like a 6-person company that has like hundreds of thousands of people in their community, and I it's like they don't have a dedicated community person, right? Like, and they're lucky right now that everyone in that community loves Rome and they can do no wrong and whatnot. But at a certain point, at a certain scale, how does a team of less than 10 people manage an angry community of 100,000 people?
Exactly. And it's just like, ooh, and there's no precedent. And the thing that's interesting about the Rome community is they're all over the internet. So like, I can't go and be like, find www.romecommunity.com and find them. Like they're literally all over. So
which also means that spreading information, if they were angry and you were like, okay, I'm the CEO of Rome, Connor, I think it is, right? I can't remember his name, but you're like, I'm going to go and be like, hey guys, like, sorry, we messed up. I'm going to be like whatever it is, right? Whatever reason the community is angry, guess what? You're probably only going to reach, this % of the community because it is so fragmented.
And it's so much like I think the other thing is they're having so much peer-to-peer learning, which is really awesome in a community. You're like, great, good job, peer-to-peer learning. Like that's what you strive for. But that also means peer-to-peer information like sharing. And we've all played a really shitty game of telephone. And you're opening yourself up to doors for that. And it's like, and I don't know that we have the answers for that. Like I don't have a wipe the internet with a magnet button. Sorry.
Well, you also get this problem, I think, where like communities at a certain scale start to have like negative, like at a certain point, if you hit a certain scale in your community, there will be bad actors in it. There is literally no way around it. And you see this a lot where I think Clubhouse is a great example, right? Where they were like, we don't need to do moderation, like screw that. And then it was like, well, because you left the doors wide open, people took advantage of it. Maybe not, no one was like, I'm going to go to Clubhouse and be an asshole, but the doors were open, they wandered in, and it happened. And you've seen how people reacted to it. Like I know people that will like swear they're like, I will never use Clubhouse because they did not respond well to a bad action in their community. And it's the problem is it's like it's this problem of like once you set, like you're seeing Facebook and Twitter deal this right now. For 10 years, they set a precedent of like, we don't give a shit what you say. Be racist, be sexist, spread false information. We don't care. And now trying to change that and go back is almost impossible because everyone who was doing that, you're like, well, you're censoring me or abusing me or whatnot. So it's this problem of like when you're building a community, you have to set that foundation right from day one. Because if you do your community and your product right, that community will outgrow you. And then you can't go change the foundation once the building is 10 stories tall.
No. Well, and I think there's two kind of things that you brought up here. There's one, this idea, I think Rosie Sherry actually mentions it. So thanks, Rosie. It's like you can't be building your community on like a shaky ground. So you can't be building your community on another platform is always risky because the platform could go away tomorrow. And I think that's what we're seeing with like Clubhouse or some of these other communities that are very like up and go. There's a risk. Like I come from someone who loves early stage startup, but they're risky. They could not be around in a year.
No, they're not risky at all.
I think like the other side of it is, you know, we're getting in an area of like, there's, you know, I think the best advice that I was given, not just, it came from journalism school advice, is like come from a place of wanting to understand. So when you're approaching a problem, don't be like, oh my goodness, like this is a bad actor, or this is someone who's thing like, what is it? Like the injured dog will always bite. Like they will. So
or the corner dog. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. The corner dog is like, yeah, that metaphor. Wow, really great with my metaphors today. But like, it's, you know, if you comment someone and you're like, you're wrong. Why are you sharing fake information? Why are you being rude? You've
already lost. Yeah.
You're already going to lose. Instead of going like the DMs are magic, like slide in someone's DM and go, hey, how are you? And usually like I start the conversation always like, how you doing? And sometimes like people usually in community spaces will be a little too honest with you. And they're like, my dog died. I had no hot water. I didn't get enough coffee. Like life is just shit today. And you're like, okay, now I know.
You know how they say like a barber or a bartender is like a free therapist? If there's one thing I've realized in community in the past like 5-6 years is like, I should probably go and like actually get like a therapy license.
Or go take some social, like I like love, like I'm actually in a social work class right now. Go take them. Like I'm in a social work class on death and dying. And it's like, I'm learning of how to have good, tough conversations even better.
Yeah. Like just basic human psychology and relationship building. Like that's the thing is like when people ask, just sidebar, people come to me and they're like, okay, I want to start a community. What platform do I pick? And I'm always like, whoa, hold up. Step like 12 steps back first, right? And start with those basics, right? Of just like, you have to be able to talk to people and understand people and have those conversations. I think that does lead into, because people ignore that, right? And that's when you end up with the problem of the fake news or the asshole on your platform or things like that. It's like you ignore it for so long that now you can't do anything about it.
Exactly. And it's just like, there's actually, you know, in one of my sociology classes, they taught about the hard methodology. So you can say anything you want as long as you say it hard. And so that's, you know, 4 steps. So it's an acronym. It's, you have to be honest. You have to be accurate. You have to be respectful, which I think is the most important part. Like honest and respectful. Okay. All of them are important, but then you have to be direct. And I think like, unfortunately, we see a lot of the comments. It's like, we get some passive aggressive actions happening, which is like, you're serving no one. Like, just be direct. Even if it's bad news, even if you're like, hey, I'm banning you for life from this platform. I'm banning you because of XYZ have violated these terms of service, you know, blah, 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 blah. Insert nice thing here.
Yeah.
Have a wonderful day. Sorry. And you don't need to justify yourself more. Like, just end of sentence.
Actually, adding justification in my experience makes that harder because then the person will be like, well, I have a specific, like, you know, thing to fight back on now, right? It's like, you're being banned for this. Well, oh, well, I disagree with you. That post didn't break the rule. And you're like, okay. Like, it's a very interesting fine line. I think on that specific topic and also like dealing with toxicity, I think this actually bleeds into product led a lot. I think a lot of just community managers in general in product led, like whether it's B2B or B2C, could learn a lot from the gaming industry. Because I think the gaming industry has adopted this idea of a product led community. I mean, it's been doing it for 30 years, right? And well before the rest of the business world was. And this idea of like dealing with bad actors, like you put a bunch of anonymous 12 to 24-year-olds together in one platform. And I mean, I can't even I could sit here for 7 hours and just tell you stories of the shit that I've dealt with in those sorts of scenarios. But it's like a lot of the learnings from that, I think, apply to B2B. And the problem is because like the more like, B2B and B2C are just starting to invest in community, they haven't experienced the bad stuff yet. So they're unwilling to invest in preventing it up front.
Exactly. And I think a really great exercise, actually, the former creative director run this through with me. And so one really, really great exercise to always do is be your own worst enemy. So sit down with your team and invite every member to the team, because someone is always better at hurling insults than you are.
Oh, yeah.
And invite everybody down. And we actually recently did this with our team, and make them insult you. Like, just sit down and like open up a Miro board or a Jamboard or whatever your collective working software and just go. Like, what is the absolute worst case scenario that'll happen in your community? And then make a plan. So it's like, because you'll find that 9 times out of 10, most of those are kind of unrealistic, but you'll hit 1 or 2. And
if there's one thing that happens, by the way, it will happen. Like the worst case scenario, like it's just, you like think about like the amount of, it's a very simple thing, right? Like if you have 500 people in a community, there are 62,000 potential connections amongst those 500 members, just one-to-one connections. The chance of one of those connections leading to a bad situation, 1 in 60,000, like that's not very high chances, but that's how many connections you have, right? It will happen. Like, I mean, I to give you an idea, my first community was like a gaming community, and we had, on any given day, we had like 100,000 unique players a day. We had a fully volunteer staff of almost 100 moderators just to and they could barely keep up with what we had to deal with from 100,000 people.
Yeah.
Like, then you imagine what companies like Twitter or Facebook are dealing with tens of millions or even billions of users, and it's insane.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point. I think it's why it's like, love your community manager, help them out, be nice, be a good person in the community, because it encourages other people to like bubble it up. But I think the best thing is like I say, the DMs are magical. So my secret community, not so secret community building tool and tactic is an Airtable spreadsheet, which sounds very lame and very like basic, but I usually keep it. I write a link every time someone joins the community. I drop their name down and I put their name, and I usually try and introduce myself and be like, this is who I am, this is what I'm up to, nice to meet you, how you doing today? And then usually they'll tell me, they'll be like, oh my goodness, great, I found this community because I'm interested in blah, and then I take note of that.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, am I serving that to them, or is this community a bad fit? And then I just go, hey, that's really great. We're not discussing that in this community, but why don't you try da-da-da-da-da-da?
There's a lot of like room to apply like customer success principles, I think, should be applied to community more. This idea of like, right, like always the classic example of like salesperson sells to a person, then the person churns 6 months later, and it's like, how dare you, customer success? And it's like, that person probably shouldn't have been a customer in the first place, right? So a lot of these principles around like knowing who your members are, why they're there, what they want out of it, like almost the idea of like an NPS score type thing, like applied to community, like that's the old. I'm once again, I don't know how you track this necessarily and put a number to it, because it's different from each community and platforms and things like that. But this idea of like a community satisfaction score, right, is like, that's the thing that like you should try, even if it's like anecdotal, even if it's just you like manually tracking in a spreadsheet of like, this is why this person's here, our community can serve this or can't serve this. Like, you don't want to be the salesperson who sells someone like, oh yeah, our product will grow your hair back, and it's like, oh, but it won't. Like, they're not going to be a happy customer. Like, it might be a short-term win, right? It actually goes back to the idea of like the this cardinal metric of being like number of members, where like community managers will try to grow their community at all costs, versus like, I know people that have 500-person communities that have more budget than people that have 500,000 person communities, because they've been able to prove the value that 500-person community drives beyond the number of members.
For sure. And I think an interesting one that comes from this, there's a couple like when doing live events, I've had a lot of success of like I do like I'm really big fan of the informal poll. So I'm like, I'll if someone's here and they're willing to talk to me, I usually will talk to them and be like, "How are you doing? How's life? Tell me a bit about yourself. What are you interested in? Why do you love?" I think the best thing to ask someone is like, "Why do you love our product?"
Yeah.
Or what do you wish about our product would change? And then sometimes it gives like if you're in a product led community, one of the best tools in your back pocket is that product roadmap. Like I don't care if
Oh
you're
yeah.
a software or a hardware company, you have that product roadmap. And like the number of times that I've been able to be like, oh, that's really great. Really like to see you here. Like put that on the product roadmap. And then I forget what tool it is off the top of my head because that's how it always is when you're doing a live chat. But there is a tool and you can build your product roadmap and you can upvote or downvote different requests. So you can see what the community wants more.
There's quite a few tools like that. There's one called ShipRate, which is actually funny you mentioned that because they actually have a newsletter called Build With Your Users instead of For Your Users, which is exactly that whole principle, right? And it's almost this idea of like this also goes back a bit to what I was saying before. This idea of like I think there are a lot of product led communities that aren't actually communities from the outside looking in the way that we as community builders would define them, but there's a lot of room to apply those principles to an entire business, the openness, the transparency, the trust, the authenticity of community building to product development, to customer support. Even if you don't have that Slack or that forum or whatever that community channel is, those core principles can still be applied to everything related to your product.
Yeah. And I think just being that, like, it's interesting because you turn around and you talk to your engineering team and they will always tell you something else. 9 times out of 10. And sometimes the things that the community wants are literally the easiest fixes. Like,
yep.
I've had people that have been like in software, like they're like, I want a dark mode. I'm like, okay, like sometimes that's a very easy thing versus a entirely new feature. But then you also have like, I will give it a grain of salt because sometimes community members don't know what they want. But that's building any product, right?
Or they also will do things like, I want this thing, and you're like, that doesn't make sense. Like it's a balance, right? Like you can't be just community led with your product development. You have to balance. Like I always would say, there's three things you're balancing when you're building a product. There's like the desires of the users, the community, the customers, whatever. The desires of the market, like people who are not yet customers, but things you could build to bring new people in. And then the kind of like technical, like, is it even possible? Because like there's that classic saying that never actually was said by Henry Ford, but I think it's a great line, right? The idea of like, he's like, if he'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses.
Yeah.
Which has been proven that he didn't actually ever say that. But the line, I think, still is beneficial, right? Where it's like, you have to be, and I think that's where a community manager's job really gets difficult, because you're kind of 50% on the community members side, but you're also obviously employed by and working for the company side, right? And like having to find that balance of making sure the community is happy, making sure their voices are being heard, but also balancing like the business needs and the company needs and the actual realistic probability of things being able to get done. And I've seen a lot of community managers in product-led communities where they're just like, someone asks for them, like, yeah, I'll talk to the team. We'll get that edited. It's like, hold up a second. Like, usually as a community manager, you don't have the authority to like define that something necessarily will get added. You don't know if it will. Like, so that once again, it comes back to like authenticity and trust. Whereas like, people sometimes put like community short-term happiness as the top thing, right? And like sometimes community building requires those hard conversations, and you're actually probably better off just having those hard conversations up front.
Exactly. It's managing expectations on both ends.
That's a short way of putting my long-winded grammar.
On both ends though. You're also like, and this is a structure thing that I think we need to get in tangent. Like so often I think marketing, communications, and community has been so separate from product development, which I think is a huge tragic flaw.
Yep.
Like you need to have a community manager in a product position. Like, and if you're a community manager for a product-led company, get your butt to those product meetings. Find out when stand-up is, find out when all those meetings are. And like that should be the first place that you invite yourself, and make friends with your developers.
Or also the other thing I will say, get the developers and the product managers involved in the community. Like one of the things we do is like, it used to be like, you have an idea for ComStore and you're in our community, like, oh, you got to like talk to Mac and like, I'll pass it on. But now we just like, I just put our developers in the product channel and like they talk directly with the users. And it does two things. One, it actually allows the engineers and the product people to get more, user empathy because they're actually talking to real people versus like seeing it as like a written story on a product management software, which like removes the human element 100%. And they're able to actually delve into the why. It's not just user wants dark mode. Okay, great. User wants dark mode. Like, I don't give a shit. Oh, user wants dark mode because they actually have eyesight problems. Like they're like getting that like human empathy angle on the product features actually enables engineers to understand it better and make better decisions. So I think it goes both ways of like a community manager's job in a product community is actually like, it's less build a community and more take the community, take the company and pull them together.
I love that you said this. This gives me so much validation of my job today. So thank you. This is like, so I'm in a neurotech company right now. I manage a couple of different little communities related to it. But one, we do have a Discord channel. We found that Discord works really well because we're dealing with a lot of academics, early adopters, chronic, very innovation, new tech people. So they're literally people who are more likely to be on Discord than Slack. And we found that a lot of people were like, I don't care to be on another Slack channel. We're like, all right, fair, Discord it is. But I threw our whole company on everybody, like from the founder to like interns are all in our Slack channel. And they all have a Discord channel, and they all have like a little Team Neurable badge. And so they're all in there. I log in and sometimes I see like our scientists just chatting away. Like they have more like, sometimes I like come in and I joked one day, like at our stand up, I was like, man, I come in to say hi to them and they're like, whatever, Erin, like, where's the science team? I'm like, okay, thanks, bye. And they we did a Halloween event with them, which is like, you think about this, like I'm working with directly engineers and scientists and people that you don't think of when you're going community building. Like these are people that don't necessarily come to the forefront of mind, but we all showed up in costume for a live video Discord trivia hour for like an hour and just hung out together with some random strangers on the internet. But we had buy-in from everybody, which is, I also find that if you can make it a fun experience for your internal team, it makes it easier to justify to your boss.
Well, that's why it's like community building, especially in a product-led community, it's not just for the customer, and that's really that big difference. And that's why I wrote the post. It was like defining the layers of community at companies, and in reality, like community is about like kind of merging those layers together in a sort of way. And it actually goes back to the idea as well of like you're building the boundaries for community. I think you mentioned how like they're actually more excited to talk to like the other members of the team than you are. I think that's a very common trap that community managers fall into is like the community gets a little too associated with the community manager, right? It's like, it's not that I don't go to this community to talk to the community. I go to this community to talk to Erin. And if you fall into that trap, you got a big problem. Okay, what happens if that community manager leaves the team, right? Or like it might make it hard for you to leave the team, even though that might be the right decision for you to do because like you are too like there's like interesting thing of like community is inherently a very personal thing, but you have to build it in a way where it's not a community of personality or cult.
Yeah, it's like you can't be a community of one. You can't all be talking like I take the morbid approach that you should build your role at any company. I don't really care what role you're building, whether it's a community person or a marketing person or a product person or engineer, that if you get hit by a bus tomorrow, someone can read through your documentation and be like, this is what this person was doing. And maybe that's a very morbid way of thinking of your role or yourself.
Well, I mean, I think it is especially with community, especially when community is typically a team of one, right? It's right. Like, and it sounds, once again, it's a very morbid way of putting it, but like typically on an engineering team, even in early, if you have 20 people at a startup, 10 or 12 are on the engineering team. One gets hit by a bus, chances are like the engineering team will survive, right? Typically there's one person on community who knows the community, who's the go-to person. If you're gone tomorrow, if your community, like you haven't built community right, if your community dies without you. And it's a thing you have to do over time. You can't do that from day one. Like in the community club, for example, the first 200 members were all personally invited by me. Every time someone asked a question, I was like, I got to jump in and make sure they're getting a response. When someone joined, I got to make sure I introduce them and welcome to the community. But over time, you have to like be able to like, I think it's in Get Together, which is just, obviously a great book on community building, that third stage of passing the torch. You have to structure your community to enable that to be possible, both to your team and to community members.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really good one. And I see Ariel dropped a question of like, how do you do this in practice? And I think you're meaning of like the passing the torch part. And I think I referenced my trusty Airtable spreadsheet of like documenting like names, like, and I have their person name. And then I think a really good one, like, I think if we want to build a better future, we need to start with those little actions. So I ask pronouns, or if I catch them using pronouns, use them. Be respectful.
There's a Slack bot you can get now if you run your community on Slack, which when someone joins, it lets them pick and automatically adds it as a prefix. I just saw it the other day. Yeah.
Oh, that's a really good one.
Actually,
yeah,
I don't remember what it's called, but
I always watch that. And then I know on Reddit and Discord, people will go by usernames sometimes rather than names. So unless they explicitly tell me, hey, Erin, I'm so-and-so, then I'm like, oh, username it is. I'm not trying, even if I know the person.
Yeah.
Like, I make sure that it's a very trusted thing, but I document this all in my trusty Airtable. And then like I have like notes. So I have like in my Airtable in the top column, I have a date. So it'll say date, and I just use it for like a Monday of the week. And I try to see how many people I'm like, okay, how can I engage with different people in that community this week? And then I leave notes. So, there's another person on my team that does community building as well. And she's learning the ropes. So I make sure that she also has these notes. So if she logs in, she can be like, great, I need to, Erin has already talked to these whatever people today. I'm not going to double talk on them. But then as much as you make your community guidelines and expectations for your actual community, you also need to make them for your internal community team. So I had a lecture before we even launched our Discord community and was like, hey, internal team, here's my expectations from you. If you don't want this to suck, here's what we're going to do. Like, here are the different things that we can work on to make it a successful place. Like, be inclusive, be inviting, be someone who's, who you want to be in the community. Share what you're excited about.
Lead by example.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's like people. Well, I always love the example once again to use the community club of like when someone joins, there's like a bunch of emojis. People say hello. No one. We didn't put a guideline of like, hey, please welcome new members. Right. We didn't say do this. We just did it. And people like I think this is also one of the things we mentioned before of like if you don't set the rules and expectations from day one. Right. It's like people will act the way they see the community acting. If someone joins and like, wow, this community's full of assholes, they're either going to be like, cool, I'm an asshole, this is for me, or they're going to leave. So you end up like this like vicious cycle of like whatever your base of community is very likely what your community will continue to be. I think it's, I think Ariel asked a good question actually right on that line of like, how do you actually change member behavior?
Yeah, that's another good one.
We're going to get kicked off here in 3.5 minutes.
Yeah, all right, no pressure. I think on that point, like when you're changing member behavior, one thing that it's like really important to manage is like understand why they're having that behavior. So if you don't know why they're acting that way that they are, that's the first problem in itself. So understand the reason why they're acting. That comes into sliding in the DMs. So, hey, how are you doing today? If they told you their dog died and 16 other things went wrong in their life, that's a good thing. But you can be like, hey, I noticed you were exhibiting behavior X. This is something that we don't stand for in this community. Yada, 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 explicitly put like, here's what's going to happen. Like, you're not going to get banned, you're going to get banned, so on and so forth. We'd like you to participate. Why don't you try participating in XYZ manner? The really good one, like offering solutions or.
That's a great answer. The solution angle versus like, don't do this. Like, okay, well, what am I supposed to do?
Exactly. And make sometimes like a lot of times, like in my previous role, I was running a lot of tech support. And I am not a customer service person. It's not my favorite thing to do. I do it, but it's not my like hierarchy of things I want to do. Not great. So I want to I usually take that and be like, great, this is an awesome question. I would love to direct it to the customer service team. Please contact person X here. Or if you're using, I know on Intercom, they have the service where you can directly loop them into a conversation. So just start up a tab in Intercom or whatever your customer management program is. And it kind of, you're directly giving them something to do rather than being like, I'll get back to you on that.
I think that's a great answer. I think it is this, it's also a slow thing, right? Anything like that with changing behavior, and that's another thing, just the thing with community. I think when it comes to like struggling to prove community's value is that community is inherently a slow thing. And especially at tech companies where they're so used to like, go fast, break things, move fast, go, go, go. Like put $1 in, get $2 out, put $2 in, get $4 out. Like go, 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 go. Like that's like, it's like there's everyone's just like basically like hyped up like on sugar 24/7 in the tech industry, right? and sugar is like the nice way of saying that. But I think community is inherently like it is a slow process, right? It takes time, and I've used the analogy. It's like growing an apple tree, right? And you have to be willing to put the time in, and it's going to take a lot of work at the start. You're going to find the right place. You got to nurture it. You got to make sure it survives. it'll take 2 years before it's bearing fruit. But once it bears fruit, it'll bear fruit for 150 years. And you can go into more like maintenance mode and versus like growing mode. And I think that's, I don't know, we're almost on time here, but
yeah. I'll be in
on
the
that
Slack
note,
channel if you guys need anything for the last 40. I'm happy to chat in the Slack channel. So happy to answer.
awesome. And we'll put this recording on the forum. So if you're watching this after the fact, I'm sure you can drop questions on that post, and Erin will do her best to hop in and drop her thoughts there. Async,
sure.
The beauty of async, right?
Right. Async is wonderful. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me and letting me nerd out.
Yeah, no, thanks for joining us. It's always a pleasure to chat. That's the worst part about the best part and the worst part of the community is you can just talk to everyone all day.
Right. Good thing we get paid to do that, right?
Basically. All right. On that note, thanks for joining us. Bye.
Bye.